Alright guys, welcome to a new module. Now, a few modules back, we built this beautiful to-do list, and in the process we learned about a whole bunch of things, such as how to use EJS templates and how to pass data between your server and your EJS files. Now, there's just one problem with this app as it is though, because if we added in a new item, let's say test, and yeah, it looks great, and when we refresh it, it's still there. But if I go ahead and just restart my server, so at the moment I'm running app.js using NodeMon. So if I just type in rs into the command line and hit enter, then it will restart my NodeMon server. And this is equivalent to, say, if you were running your app using Node, app.js, then every single time you make a change in your app.js, then you would have to rerun node app.js, and NodeMon basically does that automatically behind the scenes. But you can also just get it to restart the server by just typing rs. So now we've restarted our server, and if I now take a look at our localhost 3000, if I go ahead and refresh this website, you can see that that item that I just added disappears. And the reason for this is because currently all of these items are stored inside an array. And every single time I restart my app.js, I rerun it, then it wipes that array to the default items that we began with. And all of the new items I added gets wiped out, and it's no longer saved in our app, which is not a great user experience, to be honest. Now that we've learned about databases and how to persist our data, then this is a perfect use case. So we're going to update this app to start using MongoDB to save our data to a MongoDB database. And you'll see that afterwards, no matter how much I restart my server or whatever changes I decide to make to my app.js or the rest of my website, all of my data will be safely saved in our database. So let's get started. So in the last lesson, you should have gotten hold of the starting files for the second version of our to-do list. If you go ahead and just unzip it and place it on your desktop or into your development folder, then we can drag it onto Atom and we can get started. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that we don't actually have a Node modules folder. And that is, of course, because whenever we download something from the internet, usually it won't come with the Node modules, so we have to cd over to the location of our folder and then just run npm install or npm I in that folder, and then it'll go and look at all the dependencies we have in our package.json, for example, body parser, EJS, and Express, and it will install it and create our Node modules folder. So now that we're ready to upgrade our to-do list to a version that actually has a database on the back end, then the first thing we should look at is how are we storing our data currently? Well, we currently have this constant called items, which has an array of default objects to begin with. And then when we add or post new items into our app.js, then we push those items into the relevant arrays. So for example, the items array or the work items array. Now we're going to delete all of these arrays and we're going to be using Mongo and Mongoose instead. So the first thing we have to do is we have to install Mongoose, of course. So let's go ahead and run npm install Mongoose. And now that should add that to our package.json, and it'll add the relevant modules into our Node modules folder. So now that we've got access to our Node modules, we're going to now require our Mongoose. So we're going to create a constant called Mongoose, and it's going to be requiring the Mongoose package that we just installed. The next thing that we need to do is to go ahead and create a new database inside MongoDB. The way that we do that, as we've seen before in previous modules, is mongoose.connect, and then the thing that we're going to connect to is the URL where our MongoDB is hosted locally, which is traditionally mongodb colon 2// localhost colon 27017. And then we're going to write one further / and we're going to specify the name of our database, which in this case, I'm just going to call ToDoList DB. And then finally, remember, if we wanted to not have that little warning show up, if we want to avoid that deprecation warning, then we have to add that little flag in there, which is use new URL parser colon true. And at some point in the future, you won't have to do this anymore because Mongoose and Mongo will update their code. But for now, if you're seeing that deprecation warning when you don't have this in, then this is the way to work around it. So now that we've specified how we're going to connect to our MongoDB and which database we wanted to create or connect to, then the next step is to create a new schema, right? And we want to create a new items schema. I'm going to leave this up to you as a challenge. I want you to create something called items schema. And this is only going to have one field, which is called name. And the names of each of our items are simply going to be of data type string. Remember, this is roughly what a Mongoose schema would look like. We have the const keyword, then we specify the schema name, and then we set it to equal a new JavaScript object with a key value field. And the key is going to be the name of the field, and the value is going to be the data type of our field. So you've done this before. Pause the video and try to complete the challenge. So this is pretty simple. All we have to do is create our const, and then we create our items schema. And this is going to be equal to whatever field it is that we want into our schema. And we're only going to have one field, which is going to be the name of the item. And the name is going to be, of course, a string data type. Now we have our item schema. The next thing we need to create is a new Mongoose model based on this schema. Again, as a quick reminder, this is what Mongoose models look like. We create a new constant and we use the mongoose.model initializer to create that new model. And in order to create it, we have to specify two things. The singular name of our collection. So if we had a collection called people, then the singular form would be person, and that has to be in the form of a string. And then we have our schema, which we provide. Pause the video and try to complete that challenge. All right, so we've already created our schema, and we now have to create our model based on the schema. Let's create a new constant, and we'll call our model item with a capital I. So remember, whenever you have a Mongoose model, it's usually capitalized. And this is going to be equal to a mongoose.model, and we're going to create the model passing in two arguments. The first thing is the singular version of our collection name. So we're going to have a collection called items, and that means that the singular version is going to be item. And then the second argument is going to be the schema that we're going to use to create this items collection, which is of course our items schema that we created a little bit earlier on. So now we have a schema and we have a model created using that schema. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to delete everything that's related to this day and get date. I'm just going to simplify our code a little bit. Instead of having to use our date module and instead of having this date file, we're going to just simply render the default list with a title that's called today. And this way will cut down the complexity of working with the date and the external modules, and also trying to understand how MongoDB is going to be plugged in to our app. So this just makes it a little bit easier to understand. Now that we've replaced the list title with a simple string, the second thing that we're passing over to our list.ejs is our items array, which, if you remember, we deleted, so it no longer exists. And instead, we want to pass over the items that are inside our items collection. to do that, we need some default items, right? So let's go ahead and create 3 new documents using our brand new item Mongoose model just around here. And I'm again going to leave that up to you as a challenge. Just as a reminder, the way that we create new documents using Mongoose is something like this. So we would create a new constant, then we would bind it to a new model name. So in this case, that would be item. And then we specify the values for each of the fields in our schema. We've done this before, and so I want you to pause the video and try to create 3 new documents, which will be the default items in our to-do list, and they can say whatever it is you want them to say. Following that format, we're going to create our item 1, and this is going to be a new item. So we're saying that we're creating a new document from our item model, and then we pass in our fields, right? So the field that is called name is going to say, welcome to your to-do list. And that's one document out of the way. Now I'm just going to go ahead and create 2 more. So now I've created 3 documents, item 1, item 2, and item 3, and they have some arbitrary names. So the first item is just going to say, welcome to your to-do list. The second one's going to say, hit the plus button to add a new item. And the third one's just going to say, hit this checkbox or hit this thing over here to delete an item. Now that we've got our 3 documents, let's go ahead and put them all into an array. And I'm just going to call this default items. It's going to be a new array, and it's just going to contain item 1, item 2, and item 3. Now that we have our array, then we could use one of the methods in Mongoose called insert many, so that we get to insert all of these items in one go into our items collection. Again, just as a quick reminder of how the syntax for insert many looks like, then you can see it looks something kind of like this. We provide the model name, which refers to the collection that we want to insert our data into, and then we provide the actual array of documents that we want to insert, and finally we get a callback, which may or may not contain an error, depending on how the process went. So while I'm showing you a lot of syntax using slides, you can also, of course, just simply read the docs inside Mongoose, right? So if you go to the docs and you go over to the API and find the model API docs, then you can find these things such as insert many and see the full explanation and example as well. So don't feel like you have to rely on just the hints that I've given here. Coding is essentially an open book exam. You can refer to as many sources as you like in order to get to the answer. Pause the video and try to insert all of our items into our items collection. All right, so in order to insert it, we're going to specify that we want to insert our items into the items collection. So we'll refer to the item model. And then on that model, we're going to call insert many. And we're going to provide 2 arguments. One is, what do we want to insert? Well, we want to insert our array of default items. And the second thing is we have to provide a callback just in case there's any errors. So we could say something like, if there's an error, then log the error, else simply log successfully saved default items to database. Just before we run our app.js, just make sure that you check your code, that there's no errors anywhere, that you've got everything all set up with your model, your schema, and your documents. Over here, I've just spotted that I've actually got a bit of a typo. Instead of user, it should be use new URL parser. Now that I'm happy with my code, then it's time to head over to my console and make sure that you've got a Mongoose process running. So you should have this set up from the last module. And we should also have a Mongo shell that's enabled on another tab as well. So now make sure that you've CD'd over to where your app.js is, and we're finally ready to run our app.js. So now if I hit enter, you can see that we get the server started, but also we get the message that says successfully saved our default items to database. If we switch over to our Mongo shell and we say show DBs, then we now have this extra database called ToDoList DB. And if we go ahead and say use ToDoList DB, and now we show collections, you can see we've now created this collections called items. And this is all done when we created our Mongoose model and specified the singular name of our collection. So now if we say db.items.find, basically find all, then now we've got 3 documents saved in there which correspond to our default list that we want to show when we create a new to-do list, right? So that was pretty successful. Now, if you have any problems with starting up your Mongo shell or with your Mongodb server, then just have a look inside the course resources for this lesson, where you can see some ways of debugging what the issue is and fixing it if needed. But hopefully you're on the same page as me and you've got your server started and you've successfully saved your items. The next step is to read from our database inside our app.js. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.